Hello and welcome to today's program, Thinking Northeast Asia, the Year in Review. We're so happy you've joined us. My name is Jonathan Corrado. I'm the Policy Director for the Korea Society. In the next hour, we plan to review the political and security situation in Korea and beyond. We're taking your questions live, so please send them in now and throughout the program to policy@koreasociety.org. Today's discussion is a big task, but we're lucky to be joined by the fantastic Mr. Ralph Cossa, who has over 50 years of experience in U.S. security policy in Asia. Ralph is President Emeritus of Pacific Forum, a member of the ASEAN Regional Forum's Experts and Eminent Persons Group, and a founding member of the Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia-Pacific Steering Committee. Ralph served in the U.S. Air Force from 1966 to 1993, achieving the rank of colonel, and last serving as Special Assistant to the Commander of the U.S. Pacific Command. He also served as Deputy Director at the National Defense University's Institute for National Strategic Studies. Ralph, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome back to the Korea Society.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be here. And aloha to everyone.
Why don't we start off with North Korea? Wondering if you can give us a sense for where we sit today and how the situation has changed over the course of 2021. Just to prime the pump a little bit, this year we've seen attempts to revive talks with North Korea that have struggled to get off the ground so far. Seoul is proposing an end of war declaration, and the new Biden administration is offering to meet North Korea without preconditions. Meanwhile, while the rest of the world has started to open up, North Korea has mostly kept its borders closed. Diplomatically as well, it has not engaged. North Korea did refrain from nuclear and ICBM tests this year. However, it did conduct a number of other missile launches, including one of the submarine-launched variety. So Ralph, if we kind of zoom out and put this in a broader context, where are we in this historical moment? And what are the potential dangers and the potential paths forward to improve the situation?
Thanks, Jonathan. Great question. We could spend probably 2 hours just on that question. I'll sort of caveat my remarks by saying, when it comes to North Korea, we're all guessing. As you mentioned, I've been doing this for over 50 years. I started out guessing about North Korea in 1969 as an Air Force intel officer at Osan Air Base. We continue to guess today. It's a pretty opaque society. It's important to listen to what they say. That sort of let hope be the enemy of realism. The question today, I think, is are we at a crossroads or are we at a dead end? And I'm more inclined to think we're closer to the dead end than a crossroads. I don't think we've got a historic moment coming up anytime soon. My view, when President Biden wakes up in the morning and looks at his to-do list on the wall, North Korea is nowhere on that list. South Korea is. He wants to keep the alliance strong, and we'll talk about that, I guess, in a few minutes. But North Korea, he has an experienced team of Asia folks working for him in the White House and at State and Defense. I think they all look at North Korea as sort of a lose-lose situation. And when you face a lose-lose, the best thing to do is not play the game. So I don't think anyone's really eager to get involved with North Korea. We've said we're prepared to meet with them anytime, any place. But they know that the only thing we want to talk about is denuclearization, and that's the last thing that they plan on talking about. I've met with the North Koreans on a number of occasions. They've made it very clear that they would love to have talks with us about nuclear policy as one major powerful nuclear weapon state to the other. That they're fully prepared to give up their nuclear weapons as soon as we're prepared to give up ours. The North Koreans at one time, we used to say they thought they were Pakistan. Now they think they're the former Soviet Union. Of course, that's, in my view, a bit delusional. But if the dear leader says that, they have a powerful sword and they're prepared to use it, then the rest of them have to march in lockstep and go along with it. So I don't think we're really approaching anything very meaningful right now. I think the end of war declaration discussions, I hope, are just a way of trying to make President Moon feel good, while essentially waiting him out to see who's the next president in South Korea and what direction they want to go in. And I think the North Koreans are doing the same thing. The North Koreans have had many opportunities over the past 3 years to show some sense of gratitude toward President Moon for his many efforts to try to bring them out into the international community. And they haven't shown much respect in that area. In the meantime, as you intimated in your very good summary in the beginning, they're very internally focused. Guess what? So are we. Guess what? So is the rest of the world. And as long as we're now talking about new variants of the COVID virus, people are still going to be focused much more internally, focused on trying to recover economically. And the North Koreans seem to be muddling along without us. I'm sure they would like us to give up sanctions. You've got the Russians and the Chinese trying to convince us to do that, but they don't appear to be ready to move even halfway or a part of the way to make that happen. So that's what gives me the sort of dead end analogy, as opposed to being at a crossroads or a quote historic moment, as you mentioned.
Right, right. So as we look down the line, then, what do you think is the most likely scenario for, let's say, 2025? Where do you think we sit? Is North Korea just prepared to continue to endure the effects of sanctions? And then what happens to the sanctions regime?
Yeah, well, this is one of the problems that I think North Korea faces right now. I've quite frankly been surprised. Now, that's the first time they've surprised me, but I've been surprised they haven't done more to sort of get our attention. The North Koreans don't mind being hated, but they hate to be ignored. And in reality, they are being ignored today by everyone except President Moon. So, when will they conduct an ICBM launch? When will they conduct another nuclear test? Those things are still shoes waiting to be dropped. And the problem is that I think that they would like to see sanctions lifted. They say they, don't care one way or the other, but obviously it's an important issue for them economically, but they're not prepared to pay a price for it. But if they were to try to ratchet up tensions, the most likely response would be a stiffening of sanctions. So they're sort of caught, between a rock and a hard place. And again, I think they're much more concerned right now about internal developments. And the sanctions regime seems to be porous enough that, as long as the Chinese continue to keep them on life support, they can get along without that. Now, where will we be in another 3 years in 2025? I guess part of that will depend on the 2024 U.S. presidential elections, and I'm not going to go there unless you really insist. And much more immediately, it depends on the next government in South Korea and what kind of policy they have and how much the U.S. and the ROK can remain or get in better sync.
Right, right. Just one more question, and that's about what kind of engagement could possibly work. So we've seen South Korea try lots of different configurations for inter-Korean engagement. And under the Trump administration, we saw this offer of a brighter future for North Korea. What kinds of things are they responsive to and might be productive in a conversation down the line?
Well, I think that's a great question. I mean, what we've seen in the past, and it's always useful to take a look at the past, is the North Koreans normally get rewarded for the absence of bad behavior, as opposed to the, actually positive steps. So they'll conduct tests, and then they'll say, okay, if we, we'll stop doing tests if you give us A, B, and C. But when it comes to the old CVID or something that moves into the actual direction of denuclearization, as soon as you get to verification, the discussion ends. So it's very difficult to have negotiations on that basis. The North Koreans have made it pretty clear over the years, what they want to see as a quote end to U.S. hostile policy. And it includes removing the alliance, removing capabilities in Guam, et cetera, that might threaten them, things that we're certainly not going to do. Now, I think there's an opportunity, if the North Koreans were prepared to take it, to talk about some type of a Korean federation or peaceful coexistence between the North and the South. I would like to see more movement in that direction. But right now, I think the main difficulty is that both Koreas claim that they are the sole representative of all Koreans. Until they can come up with some agreement to, quote, share sovereignty and recognize each other's sovereignty, which essentially they did de facto in both joining the United Nations, but what they really haven't done constitutionally. It's going to be very difficult to find some common ground. But to me, that's sort of the best that we can hope for.
Yeah, right. Well said. Thanks for that. Okay, so let's move on to U.S.-South Korea relations. Today, the United States and South Korean defense ministers met for the 53rd ROK U.S. Security Consultative Meeting. This is the first one since Biden took office and the last while President Moon is still in office. The allies discussed contingency plans for a conflict scenario, updating it for the first time since 2010. They also covered Afghan transfer and a broader role for Korea. At the Biden-Moon summit in May, we saw a focus on expanding the relationship into the wider region, including overlap between the U.S. free and open Indo-Pacific strategy and Korea's new Southern policy. So as you see it, looking at all this progress over the past year, what are the major trend lines for the bilateral relationship? What's changed, if anything, and where are we headed?
Well, I'm not sure a lot has changed. About the only thing that a lot of people have noticed is now our standard statements to talk about the linchpin, et cetera, have now also included a throwaway line about the need for peace and security in the Taiwan Strait, which obviously wasn't a Korean initiative to put that sentence in. That's been very clear on the U.S. side. And that's, again, one of the consistencies in U.S. policy between the Trump administration and Biden administration when it comes to Northeast Asia and Asia in general. I think we were smart in sort of laying out milestones to associate with Afghan transfer. And clearly, we've still got a ways to go before we reach that. And there's a great concern, I think, among Koreans and among Americans who understand or care about Korea, that we don't want to do anything that is going to undercut the presence of U.S. forces on the peninsula. That's been reaffirmed yet again. I think that's one of the concerns about the end of war declaration, is that the first thing that the Chinese and Russians would do is say, okay, the war's over, UNC gets abolished, no need and no legitimacy of U.S. troops on the Korean Peninsula. I mean, we all see that coming as the next logical move by the North and by China and Russia, which is, again, why we're trying to find a way to keep the President Moon happy with, make him feel good without doing bad. And I think that's been the real challenge here. But we're also in the middle of, increased political season. And traditionally, the U.S. has tried to stay out of the political scene and certainly not become a pawn in that. There is at least some association between trying to get the United States to agree to an end of war declaration and making one side in the political dance in South Korea look good. So I think that's another reason we're sort of hesitant. The reality is, for a long time, South Koreans have seen the U.S. as sort of the outside balancer. The old Korean proverb about the shrimp among whales. South Koreans are in a fairly dangerous neighborhood with Chinese, with the Russians, but particularly with the North Koreans. And there's always been very strong political support for the alliance, which has caused even presidents who may not be alliance cheerleaders to become them when they take office. So I think the alliance will continue. There's strong support in the United States as well for the alliance. the idea of Korea playing a broader role in the region is a nice idea. We've talked about that for at least 20 or 30 years. But in reality, as long as the South Koreans can keep the North Koreans at bay and keep the peninsula quiet, that's a sort of service enough for U.S. Regional and global ambitions.
Excellent. So let's go to China, and we've talked about this a little bit so far, but let's address it a little bit more directly now. So what have been the big trends this year regarding China and its impact on the peninsula? Earlier today, South Korea's National Security Advisor, Seo Hoon, was in China to meet with Yang Jiechi, head of China, the Chinese Communist Party's foreign affairs, to discuss the end of war declaration. Meanwhile, public opinion polls show that South Koreans are increasingly wary of China, and that's an issue that Dr. Ki-wook Shin discussed at a Korea Society program in October. So my question about this is, are we starting to see the broader US-China strategic competition having a bigger impact on the way that South Korea conducts its foreign diplomacy and the way that it sees its role in the region? We talked about shrimp between whales earlier. Is this just another chapter in that book, or is Seoul getting ready to make a decision one way or the other?
Yeah, Jonathan, it's a great question, and I guess I would disagree with part of the premise. I think the sort of deterioration in confidence in China and South Korea is not associated with U.S.-China tensions at all, but goes perhaps to the source of those tensions. And that's been the elevation of Xi Jinping, first as vice president, then as president, now as the new emperor in China, as some have described him. And more importantly, what I've proclaimed as the death of Deng Xiaoping thought in China. And in particularly the hide your strength, bide your time, a philosophy that Xi is now proving that Deng was brilliant in following that philosophy because of the results of China not following that philosophy anymore. And that's, I think, what we're seeing. I think even during the Trump administration, President Trump initially seemed to be fascinated by Xi Jinping and thought he could, deal with him. And by the end of the administration, of course, Xi was now the enemy and part of the problem. And I, quite frankly, don't blame that on Trump. I think that, the Chinese have become much more heavy-handed. I've described Xi as tactically clever, but strategically foolish. Things like that, they got the South Korean government to list of no's and all the things they'll never do again, mea culpa, mea culpa. But they've literally helped turn the South Korean people against China. I think the US has reached a conclusion, and I think this is, again, something that's carried over in both administrations, that China is really not going to be part of the solution. The question is, how do we keep them from being, part of the problem? And China can make things difficult on the peninsula, but they can't deliver the North Koreans. The North Koreans have made it very clear. The North Koreans have no love lost for the Chinese, don't trust the Chinese. And for reasons that go beyond my ability to comprehend, they also seem to think that China needs them more than they need China, despite being on life support thanks to the Chinese. But as long as that's true, and as long as the Chinese seem to believe that, and seem to believe that it's important for them to have the North Korea buffer zone, if you will, that the North Koreans are going to continue to play that, and the Chinese, at best, may prevent them from exercising more bad behavior, but they're not going to get them to move in the good behavior sense, and they've pretty well demonstrated that, and the North Koreans have reassured us that that's the case. So I think more and more both the United States and South Korea see China as part of the problem rather than part of the solution, and as a country that's not really prepared to provide that solution. And the tensions between the US and China make that worse, make it more difficult. We've heard Chinese spokesmen say, as long as you don't like us, and here's the 14 things you need to do in order to, get us to be friendly again. And until then, we're not going to cooperate, even when it's in our national interest to cooperate. Again, that doesn't give you a warm, fuzzy feeling about how China can play a positive role in the region. They're clearly violating the sanctions. They're clearly keeping North Korea on life support in order to have some stability. And quite frankly, that's not a bad idea, since we would all like to see North Korea peacefully die in its sleep, but nobody knows how to bring that about. And we certainly don't want things to erupt into a war, not even a conventional, much less a nuclear confrontation. So sort of keeping them on life support, keeping them relatively quiet is probably the best that we can hope for. And that does coincide with what China wants. At the end of the day, it's very clear that the United States visions a unified Korean Peninsula that's under the political, economic, and social structure that exists today in the South. That's not the Chinese dream. And certainly the Chinese don't want to see a unified Korea that continues to look to the US as the outside balancer and providing support, and which would still be a very dangerous neighborhood, even if a unified Korea in the middle of Europe is Germany. But in the middle of Asia, unfortunately, it's still the shrimp among whales. Maybe it become a tiger shark, but that's sort of the best we can hope for, and I'd settle for that. Again, I think unless we can reach some sort of accommodation with the Chinese and others, including the North and the South, on a sort of a mutual acceptable mid or long-term vision, it's going to be very hard to see anything but sort of damage limitation, which is what we're at today.
Right. So we saw after North Korea's sixth nuclear test, China sort of change its approach to North Korea. Are there any kinds of lines that you could see them again taking more of a stern approach and attitude towards the North? Right now, much better state of relations between Beijing and Pyongyang. Is there anything that North Korea, another nuclear test, anything that they could do that would trip that wire again?
Yeah, well, I think a resumption of nuclear testing would do that, not just because of the unsettling effect that would have in general, but the Chinese always worry every time there's a nuclear test whether there's going to be some radiation leakage that's going to be blowing over Northeast China at the end of the day. So there are legitimate national security and nuclear safety concerns that are involved with these tests as well. And the U.S. reaction to hostilities like that, and again, ICBM test and increased missile capabilities, are things like that, which the Chinese then become paranoid and think are about them. Right. So, I think the Chinese, in the greater scheme of things, don't mind the U.S. being tied down on the Korean Peninsula. But certainly don't want to provide justification for the U.S. to expand its military presence in Korea or in Asia in general. And the North Koreans are a reason for doing that. Right. If I could sort of roam her a little bit, I was at an international conference with the Chinese not too long ago, where the Chinese accused the United States of wanting to have tensions on the Korean Peninsula in order to justify a U.S. presence in Asia. And my response to them was, well, that's very interesting, but it's really no longer necessary because Chinese actions have given us all the justification we need. If we were to leave the Korean Peninsula, the Japanese would suddenly open 20 new bases for the United States. And if they keep, flexing their muscle in the South China Sea, the Filipinos, who Duterte thought he could outsmart the Chinese and play them, and then has suddenly discovered he was played by them. We would suddenly see U.S. bases returning all over the world, or at least a request for U.S. bases all over the world. Whether we'd put in there or not is another question. So I think the Chinese, one of the problems in dealing with China is that, when we sit down and say, let's talk about topic X, what could the United States have done better in this situation? Both the Americans and the Chinese can come up with a long list. But then when we say, okay, regarding topic X, what could the US and China have done? What could China have done better? Chinese can't think of a single thing they could have done better or differently, because to do that would be to criticize the current leadership. And we've seen, if nothing else, Xi Jinping does not deal well with constructive criticism. So this makes it, again, very difficult. The Chinese have to assign some ulterior motive to us or to others when we're reacting to things that the Chinese have done, because they can't say that their own actions had those consequences. That would be criticism of their leadership. That makes a dialogue and cooperation, I think, extremely difficult at the end of the day.
Right. You mentioned before Deng Xiaoping's hide your strength and bide your time.
Right.
There was an interesting article by Jude Blanchett in Foreign Affairs saying that Xi and China perceive that they're sort of operating in a time constraint here because of all the demographic pressures that they have. They're going to get old, perhaps before they get as rich as they'd like to be. So that puts sort of a cap on what sort of opportunities and potential they're going to have for maximizing their interest while they're still growing. Most likely the Chinese Communist Party is going to need to turn a lot more inward once those demographic dividends start to become due. So just wondering, do you foresee that as a major factor here? And yeah, how do you think about that?
No, I mean, I don't think so. I can't get into Xi Jinping's mind or the Chinese mind, but Chinese that I've talked to still seem to think time is on their side. That they may not be strong enough to contest the United States today, but they see by 2049 they're going to be the richest, most powerful, strongest nation in the world, and they're going to resume their rightful role as the Middle Kingdom, and everyone in the neighborhood will kowtow to them. So I don't think that they're going to get weaker, or that they see themselves as getting weaker. I think they see themselves as continuing to grow. Most Chinese believe that their military is still no match for the U.S. military, much less the combination of U.S. and its allies in the region. So this idea that there's a moment now that they have to act. The reality is they're not prepared, in my view at least, to act. I found it very interesting that Admiral Davidson, before he retired as Pacific Command commander, said he thought the Chinese might be ready in about 6 years to be able to have the capability to take on Taiwan. And immediately, most of the talking heads in Washington said, "Well, he really meant 6 minutes. It's Tora, Tora, Tora. It's going to come tomorrow." But the Chinese have to think about the consequences, and certainly what they've managed to do. Again, part of Xi's tactically clever but strategically foolish. His actions vis-a-vis Taiwan and his actions in Taiwan and in Hong Kong have essentially rung warning bells to the rest of the world. And certainly there is more vocal and demonstrable support for Taiwan democracy today than there was when Xi started turning the screws to put increased pressure on Taiwan. So, how does that help the Chinese? It's just made Taiwan stronger, and the consequences of doing something against them greater.
Right.
So I don't see the Chinese thinking that now is the time, or that we're going to somehow get weaker, demographics aside. I mean, they're trying to solve the demographics now by encouraging everyone to have 2 or 3 kids. We'll see how all of that plays out.
Right. Thanks. Yeah, fascinating. I wanted to ask about something else, and that's political ratification of the armistice as an alternative to the end of war declaration. So when we had General Robert Abrams, the former commander of CFC, UNC, USFK, here at the Korea Society for our signature policy event, he said, why don't we start with a political ratification of the armistice agreement, because that's something that North Korea, a multilateral agreement that North Korea more or less respects, at least comparatively, compared to the other agreements that it signed on to. And that this could provide a little bit of initiative and momentum. Of course, the armistice agreement, that would include China, North Korea, and the United States, but it would not include South Korea. Wondering what your thoughts are there. Would that be a productive step? Is it necessary? Could it help build some positive momentum?
Yeah, quite frankly, I'd not heard this idea before, Jonathan, and my initial reaction is that this falls in the feel good as opposed to do good category. It may be trying to find a way to throw President Moon a bone without doing any greater harm. I cannot imagine in today's political environment in Washington anything getting ratified. That requires 2/3 of the Senate, and they can't even agree that, today is Thursday or Tuesday or whatever day it is, So I would have a hard time. I think this would just sort of create another diversion. It's something that this administration certainly doesn't need more diversions. So I'm not sure how that would work. And clearly, if it cut South Korea out of the picture, the North Koreans would probably love it. But how does that serve our interests? If we wanted to push for anything, it should be the North and South reaching some sort of a bilateral agreement to peacefully coexist and do some military confidence building measures or things like that. That to me would make a lot more sense than I think it's another way of repackaging and toning down the end of war declaration, but I'm not sure strategically or geopolitically what good it would do.
Right. Okay, so let's turn to other countries in the region. We've got a new prime minister in Japan, Kishida. What sort of prospects do you see for Korea-Japan relations going forward? Are they just waiting out to see who wins the next presidential election before Japan really firms up its approach to Seoul? Is that sort of their game here? And then any new opportunities unlocked by Kishida, or are we still in the Abe era in terms of the state of relations?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we're in the not quite post-Abe era yet in Japan, and certainly Kishida is not going to make dramatic changes to anything that Abe has done. And clearly, as you intimated in your question, no one is going to do anything with President Moon. He's clearly a lame duck. He has demonstrated his anti-Japan bona fides time and time again. And you don't want to do anything today that would force a South Korean candidate to paint himself in a corner. And clearly, that's about the only thing that would happen if they made any sort of an overture today, since you don't win votes in South Korea by demonstrating that you want to hug the Japanese, even though it's certainly in Japan in South Korea's interest to have better relations. I mean, the reality is and continues to be, the United States could not defend South Korea without our bases in Japan and without Japan's active support. And every South Korean security expert understands that, but no one is prepared to write an op-ed to explain that to the South Korean people, because then they'd suddenly find themselves under attack. So at some point, I hope and look forward to the day that there's political leadership in both countries that would sort of take the step forward and move forward as opposed to continually going backwards. I'm not overly optimistic of that happening in my lifetime. We were almost there during the DJ Bucci era, and then we started backsliding from there. There are people in both countries, particularly in security specialists, who understand the importance of the relationship. I wrote a book 20 years ago, I guess, on building a virtual alliance, understanding that we couldn't do a formal three-way alliance, but that virtually the U.S. with the alliances to both Japan and Korea essentially had a virtual trilateral alliance, and we needed to just keep working on that weak third leg. 20 years later, we're still talking about that weak third leg, but it's going to require political leadership in both countries. And we're certainly not going to see that during an election period, and we're certainly not going to see that as a new prime minister is getting his feet on the ground. So I think that's, we're going to have to wait a while for that.
Right. How about Taro Kono? Do you think he would have taken a more conciliatory tone towards Korea? Still possibility for him to be prime minister in the future too.
Yeah, I think so. But again, no Japanese politician is going to make the effort unless he believes it's going to be reciprocated. So they're going to have to wait to see who is the next leader in South Korea, and whether or not that person feels strong enough that he doesn't have to play the anti-Japan card in order to get his own domestic agenda through. That's sort of more dependent on the South Korea side of the ledger than on the Japanese.
Right. Okay, so let's turn now to Russia. You talked earlier about Russia and China working together to propose sanctions reduction in order to reward North Korea for abstaining from bad behavior, as you said before, rather than from engaging in good behavior. So Russia's role moving forward, any chances for productive relations with regards to the Korean Peninsula and the wider Asian region?
There's certainly the opportunity there, whether there's the desire there, either on the part of the U.S. to reach out, or more importantly on the side of the Russians to hit the reset button, if you will. Remember the old reset button? We're still waiting for.
We've hit that a couple times now, yeah.
to hit that, and somehow or other the button seems to be jammed. But I'll tell you a story apropos of nothing. I once asked a Russian colleague, why is Russia speaking out about THAAD? THAAD, really has no implications for Russia at all. And he said, well, there are three reasons. One is that there are a few Russian generals who really worry that it might have some implications for us, but that's not the real reason. And there are some that say we need to show solidarity with our Chinese brothers, but that's not the real reason. The real reason is to irritate the United States. You've got us on the defensive with Ukraine, and you're doing, beating us over the head for this, that, and the other thing. This is a free kick for us. We can find ways of being annoying, and it really doesn't cost us anything. At the end of the day, it's going to be up to you in China and North and South to figure it out. So, it's a free kick. Don't count on us to be really cooperative. I think, in retrospect, we made a big mistake during the six-party talks to not bring the Russians in more. The reality is the North Koreans trust the Russians more than they trust the Chinese. I'm not sure they trust anyone, but on their scale of mistrust, they mistrust the Russians less than they mistrust anyone else in the world. And the Russians seem to understand the North Koreans quite well. And I think, there's an opportunity there that we should be spending more time talking to the Russians and trying to find ways that they can be an honest broker in this area and cooperate more. But right now it's going to be very difficult because they find it's a lot more fun just to irritate the United States and to sort of jab us. At the end of the day, when the Russians and the Chinese get in bed together, they both sleep with one eye open. I don't think either one really fully trusts the other. Russians have complained to me that, the Chinese are as arrogant as the Americans, but at least you won the Cold War, and, so we have to put up with you, but we really don't have to put up with these Chinese, lording over us as if somehow or other they beat us or they're more superior to us. We're still the big, existential threat to the United States, and China isn't. So I think there's some room there. I think there's also a new great game going on in Central Asia between the Chinese and the Russians. I'm sure it irritates the hell out of the Russians that The cooperative mechanism for Central Asia is the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement. It should be the Vladivostok Cooperation Agreement or some Russian city. This is the Russian near abroad. This has been, part of the old Soviet Union and part of historical Russia since Peter the Great's times. So, I don't lose a lot of sleep over, the Russians and the Chinese strategic partnership, if you will.
Right.
But there are concerns, of course, that, the Russians may do something in Ukraine that takes our eye off of Taiwan or vice versa. That can be unsettling, and we need to sort of keep an eye on it. But at the end of the day, both the Russians and the Chinese, I believe, think the relationship with the United States, strained as it is probably more important than the relationship with one another. And that's why I say they both sleep with one eye open.
Right. That's a really important point. And I've learned a lot about what's going on in Northeast Asia. But I just had one follow-up about Central Asia with regards to Russian-US relations. I've read that there's been talks between the US and Russia about potentially putting American soldiers stationing them on Russian bases in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan to help with counterterrorism operations. That would be a fascinating development. I'm not sure that that's happened before, although the US used to have a base in Kyrgyzstan at the same time that the Russians operated a base there. Right. As well. That was an interesting. So Central Asia, interesting nexus of potential for great power cooperation in certain ways. So have you heard about that? Has there been any progress there? What do you think about that?
Yeah, it beats the hell out of me, I guess, is the real answer. I don't really pretend to be a Central Asian expert, and certainly the Russians don't want to be ignored. If we're doing anything in Central Asia, they can make our life very difficult if we don't bring them in as part of the discussion. But I can't see that being, any kind of a major presence other than, of sort of a listening post trying to figure out what's happening in Afghanistan. We do have in common, neither one of us has succeeded in sort of pacifying Afghanistan. And neither of us were smart enough to have not tried in the first place. But beyond that, I think it may be an area where we can perhaps get the Russians not to undermine what we're trying to do, but I wouldn't count on a lot of long-term Russian cooperation. Although obviously, one of the things that people sort of lose sight of is that when we got ISIS and Al Qaeda out of Afghanistan, we sort of took care of our major security problem. For the last decade or two, we've really been sort of taking care of Russia and China's greatest security problem, which is Islamic fundamentalism in Western China or in Russia's near abroad. They have a lot more concern right now about the Taliban and them taking control, or in ISIS, which seems to be doing a very good job of out-insurgencying the Taliban. They've got their own hands full, I think, in that area where we were finally smart enough and politically courageous enough to acknowledge that we needed to not be tied down in Afghanistan, which gives you a quick view of what my feeling on the Afghan pullout was.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So shifting our satellite view now from Central Asia over to Southeast Asia, which is, of course, one of your big areas of expertise. You're going to know so much better than I am, even how to frame the question here. So what's going on? What are the major important developments? I just want to add one question that we got here from an audience member, Mo Su Mint from the Hudson Rivers Foundation, who asks, do you think Korea will consider taking any further concrete actions regarding coup in Myanmar, besides simply saying in statements U.S.-Korea cooperation and condemning the Myanmar coup?
Yeah, I don't see a huge role for Korea other than in sort of not undermining the international sanctions. The South Koreans have pretty well run the game in Myanmar. 10 years ago, there was a very strong North Korean presence there, and there were a lot of concerns in the United States about what North Korea was doing or could be doing in Myanmar. I think most of those, not all of those concerns, but most of those concerns have gone away. And when we were in a more constructive period in Myanmar, I think South Koreans were playing a very constructive role. Right now, of course, we're again in a damage limitation role in Myanmar. We're somewhat concerned about what the Chinese are doing there in sort of legitimizing and propping up the Tatmadaw. And I think that again may give them some short-term benefits, but they're really turning the people of Myanmar against them. And at the end of the day, I think that will come back to haunt the Chinese. One of the reasons why Myanmar, the Tatmadaw, agreed to open up in the first place, a dozen years ago, was concerned about being too reliant on China. So even the Tatmadaw has their concerns about China and just how far it would go and what the consequences are. And of course, a lot of the insurgencies along the border, the ones that they've had the hardest time coming to terms with, are the ones along the Chinese border. And that's not a coincidence in the eyes of the Tatmadaw, nor should it be. So I think that that's still a concern. The Chinese have also, I think, wreaked havoc with ASEAN. We, before Myanmar became the focus of everyone's attention in ASEAN, we were already hearing people like Billy Hare and other Singaporean and Indonesian scholars and former diplomats talking about the need to either change the consensus rule in ASEAN or expel Cambodia and Laos, particularly Cambodia, which has now been seen as a client state of China to the detriment of ASEAN unity. So the Chinese, again, I think have sort of overplayed their hand. It's going to be very interesting to watch how Cambodia, in the chair of ASEAN, is going to behave. But it's, I think the Chinese, again, have sort of overplayed their hand. When you talk to people in Southeast Asia, the first thing they say is, when the elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. They also say when the elephants make love, the grass still gets trampled. So they get nervous when the U.S. and China are too close together. That's not been a worry here lately, but certainly don't make us choose sides. Don't let us say that China is the enemy, and then they come over and whisper in your ear. But don't forget, China is the enemy, and we need to. As long as we have the 800-pound gorilla in our backyard, we want a 1,600-pound gorilla on our front porch, and that's the United States. So it's sort of a delicate dance that's being done there. But for the most part, most Southeast Asian nations feel a lot more secure when the U.S. is fully engaged in Asia. On the other hand, I think what we've seen beginning in the Trump administration and certainly continuing here is rhetorically continuing to put the words ASEAN centrality in every statement that we say about Asia policy, but in reality, looking beyond ASEAN, trying to figure out how we can work with the Indonesians and the Vietnamese individually, since they're the ones that really matter. In there, and sort of losing hope that ASEAN is ever going to be able to reach its full potential, at least in the security realm. Maybe as a economic community or as a socio-economic community, ASEAN still has a good role, but certainly in the security area, it's hamstrung by its own requirement that all 10 have have to go along in order to move forward.
Right. You mentioned Vietnam. Just want to pick up there a little bit. Another country where Korea has close relations, the United States has close relations, and also China as well plays a big role there. A lot of Korean production networks moving over, Samsung opening up factories in Vietnam. A good alternative to manufacturing in China is Vietnam. So what kind of role do we see Vietnam playing going forward?
I think Vietnam plays a critical role. Vietnam is China 20 years ago, but with the rule of law. And if you negotiate a deal with the Vietnamese, that's the deal, and they'll honor it. You negotiate a deal with the Chinese, and that's tomorrow's opening bargaining position as they start chipping away with it. The Taiwanese have been investing in Vietnam for decades now because they see them as a more reliable partner and as sort of a hedge to having too much in China. And of course, now that Taiwanese are looking at trying to get things out of China because the costs here are exceeding the benefits. Since the retribution for THAAD, a lot of the Korean chaebols are looking southward to get out of China, as well they should. There used to be the old joke, in the Soviet Union, that if you got a knock on the door in the middle of the night, it was, oh, thank God, it's only a fire. And that's becoming the case now in China as well. If Xi Jinping doesn't like what your country is doing, suddenly you as a businessman get punished. And if you're, a couple of Canadian businessmen who became diplomatic hostages because of something the Canadian government did, that doesn't encourage Canadians to invest a lot or to spend a lot of time in China. So they're going to be looking elsewhere. The Koreans have been looking elsewhere. The Japanese are looking elsewhere, and so are the Americans. And that shouldn't be a surprise. When I started out in the Asia business, where I went to buy all my cheap goods? Japan. I got all my cheap electronics there. Then it was Korea and Taiwan. Now it's China, but the future, I think, is Vietnam and Indonesia. And if India ever actually reaches its potential, India as well. So again, this is part of Xi's sort of tactically clever but strategically foolish approach. Is I think he's driving a lot of business out of China before the Chinese are prepared to fully replace that expertise.
Right. So we talked about this earlier, just a big picture framer. Jeffrey Thomas asks, how do you evaluate the Biden administration's overall Indo-Pacific policy? How are they doing? What can they do better? What are they doing well?
Well, I think it's a work in progress. The thing that I was concerned with during the last 2 years of the Trump administration, which I continue to be concerned with today, we're going to have this big summit of democracies.
Right.
Okay, that's wonderful it's in our DNA to talk about democracy and to promote democracies and everything else. But I'm a little more Machiavellian when it comes to foreign policy. And to me, as we just finished discussing, one of the critical actors in Southeast Asia is Vietnam. Vietnam is not, by our definition, a democracy. And particularly during the last 2 years of the Trump administration, we went from being against China and the Chinese government to being against the Chinese Communist Party. Well, if we want to start another ideological crusade against communism, the Vietnamese are likely to take that personally. And the reality is it's not Chinese ideology that has this upset, it's Chinese behavior. Right. And if you put pressure on China to change its behavior, they might do it. But if you put pressure on them to change their ideology, which is the source of the government's legitimacy, they're going to say, hey, you're just trying to start a new Cold War and you really are trying to contain us and don't expect any cooperation at all. So while it's in our DNA to promote democracy, I think we need to be very careful that we don't end up in some sort of an exclusionary policy or exclusionary approach that sort of rules out countries that may not have gotten to the point of democracy that we're at. And oh, by the way, we need to take a look in the mirror, because our democracy right now is not what it used to be either. When we can't even get people who were scared silly during January 6th to admit that they were scared silly, it says something about getting our own house in order before we start lecturing others on the democratic process.
Right. Okay, so now a soft power question. We talked about soft power a little bit with regards to China's lack of it, and it's the way that the wolf warrior diplomacy is sort of hurting its ability to attract other countries. So this comes from Anaga Krishna from Georgetown University, and she asks about the prospects for soft power cooperation between Korea and the US. But we could just more broadly talk about South Korea's soft power. Number one on Netflix shows, Squid Game, everything, just doing so well. Hellbound is the new one on Netflix. Lots of movies, Minari, Korean American, it's still a Korean film, I think, in a lot of ways. And of course, Parasite. So Korean soft power, to what extent does this help Korea advance on its security interests in the region?
Well, I think it's a big plus for Korea, and I'm delighted to hear soft power being raised. I will brag and say that the co-chairman of Pacific Forum's International Advisory Board are Rich Armitage and Joe Nye. Joe Nye, of course, was the father of soft power, and he and Armitage together coined the phrase "smart power," which is sort of using your hard and your soft power together in a smart way. So we'll take partial credit for that, just since we have both of those gentlemen as part of our leadership. I think that Korean soft power is an asset, and certainly Korea has become a more admired country. So has Japan. And Japan's soft power and the responsible role that it's played in Asia during the second half of the 20th century and so far in this century, I think have also enhanced both countries' soft power. Another reason why you would think that they'd find a way to get together and get along better than they do. But I think that this is a card that South Korea should be playing more, and sort of looking beyond the Korean Peninsula. But this is very difficult for South Korea. In the past, when South Korea has sort of taken on a global posture, it's been, well, what does the rest of the world think about South Korea? Not what does South Korea think about the rest of the world? So I think there's an opportunity, and certainly South Korean businesses and businessmen, as we were just talking about, also can sort of play on that image of South Korea as more of a trusted, open society. But South Korea has its own democratic challenges. As long as every former president looks forward not to a nice pension but to a jail sentence, it's going to make it a little bit difficult to really want to emulate the South Korean system. So there's still a couple of kinks that I think that they need to work out in this regard in order to fully capitalize on it. But certainly South Korea's image in the world has grown, and deservedly so. And I think that opens the door for more South Korean involvement in countries like in Southeast Asia. And it opens the door, I think, for more South Korean businessmen to sort of hedge their bets and move beyond China, as they're doing, into other areas.
Right. Well, Ralph Cossa, a master class in what is happening right now in the Indo-Pacific, what's coming up, what's important for the Korean Peninsula and the U.S.-Korean relations. Thank you so much for coming in today and sharing your insights. I learned a tremendous amount. We're always grateful to have you. Please come again soon. Lots of people to thank for this program today. Dr. Stephen Norper, who is retiring at the end of the year, sadly, who has taught me so much, and so grateful for all of his years and many, many contributions to the Korea Society. Thank you, Stephen, for teaching me so much. And the things I did well today, that's we could chalk it up to his good lessons, and the things that I messed up, we could say that's all me. I'll own all those. Peter Stumke, our IT director, does a fantastic job producing these things from the technical side. Thank you very much, Peter. Claire Callahan helps us with the communications. Thank you so much, Claire, for promoting, spreading the word, helping to recruit people, and our fantastic interns, Mina and Marina. Thank you so much for all that you do to help us make these programs possible. Please join us again December 14th. We've got a hybrid program, including both limited in-person audience and live virtual audience with Walter Russell Mead. He's the Global View columnist for the Wall Street Journal, and that program is called Global View on the Korean Peninsula. So we hope to see you back for that. Everybody have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your week, and see you again soon.
Good. Thank you. Aloha. And I'll join that shout out to Steve. He's done a tremendous job at Korea Society, and we're delighted that we now have him on the island of Oahu.
That's right. Yeah, he's defected over to your side in Hawaii, and that's great that you guys are going to be neighbors.
Right.